A patch bay is a central bay to route your signals from point A to point B. But they lived an entirely different life before the recording studio even existed. 12 years before the first recording studio opened, in 1878, Alexander Graham Bell developed the first iteration of the patch bay, and it was used to connect two people who were using his brand new invention, the telephone. 100 years later, in the 1960s and 70s, patch bays found a new home in the recording studio, and they're still being used the same way today. We use patch bays to route all of our gear to a central bay in the studio that we can use to route the signal wherever we need it to go. When you see a patch bay, it's going to be organized one of two ways: outputs over inputs, which is the most common, or inputs over outputs. And simply put, they're just two ways of thinking that are influenced by the design of our recording consoles. If we think about a console, the mic preamp is the input, which usually outputs to an EQ section. So imagine an API console where that mic preamp or that input is at the bottom of the console, which then outputs to that EQ section above it. Whereas a Neve console, the mic preamp or the input is at the top of the console, which outputs to the EQ below it. Pretty interesting if you ask me. A patch bay is simply a way to route your signal organized one of those two ways. What differentiates them are the front and rear panel connections based on each studio's individual needs. And in a pro studio, you're going to commonly find TT style connections, which stands for tiny telephone. They allow you to fit more connections in a one rack unit space, and in the recording studio, rack space is valuable. A more affordable patch bay will tend to use TRS connections, as they take up more space so you don't get as many connection points in your more affordable patch bay. And an outlier that you may experience is a patch bay with no front panel connections that's digitally controlled by software in your computer. I haven't personally encountered one in a commercial recording studio, but they are out there and they do exist. While rear panel connections only affect someone who's purchasing a patch bay, because you often don't interact with those connections, it's important to know the options that you have. It's common to see DB25 rear panel connections in the Pro Studio, and that's because a DB25 cable routes 8 connections in one cable, which is a huge convenience. A more affordable patch bay may only have TRS rear panel connections. And while you can still get a TRS snake that routes 8 connections in one cable, I often find that it's easier to connect that DB25 cable, and DB25 cables are also easier to label. So I find going the Pro option is more convenient and easier to set up. Some outlier connections you may see are EDAC90 connectors, also known as Elco connectors, which carry 24 channels. You may also encounter a patch bay with bare solder points on the back, and that's something I have experienced in commercial studios. And while you don't often interface with the rear panel connections when using a patch bay, it's still important to know the options that are out there that you may encounter, whether you're purchasing your own patch bay or troubleshooting one in the studio. Patch bays also have varying programmable features depending on what type of patch bay you encounter. And it's important to know what your patch bay can do, both if you're looking to purchase and design one, or if you're interfacing with one at somebody else's studio so you can understand how you can route signals based on their setup. The most common programmable feature for all patch bays is called normaling. And simply put, normaling is the relationship between the top connections and the bottom connections, whether those are outputs over inputs or inputs over outputs. And there's 3 types of normaling options we have for our patch bay. Our patch bay can be fully normaled, half normaled, or non-normaled. Fully normaled is the most common. It creates an internal connection in the patch bay between your outputs and your inputs below it. So for example, if you had the outputs from your mic tie lines feeding into the inputs of your mic preamps, you could normal those connections, so you could create those connections internally in the patch bay without the use of a patch cable. Ideally, you want to normal your most common connections so you can avoid using as many patch cables as possible, because every time we introduce a patch cable, we introduce a possible new point for an error to occur. In a fully normaled system, if we insert a patch cable into the output, it breaks that internal connection to the input below it. meaning that normal is no longer happening and we are now routing that output signal wherever we choose to input it using our patch cable. We can also get creative with our patch bay and use it to duplicate our signal. In a half-normal system, the outputs are still internally connected to the inputs below it, but the difference lies in what happens when we try and break that internal connection. In a half-normal system, if we were to insert a patch cable into the output, it wouldn't break that internal connection to the input below it. And that allows us to duplicate our signal and send it to two locations at once. So you can see a half-normal system might allow you more creative recording or mixing capabilities. And as you can imagine, a non-normal system breaks that internal connection, meaning the top outputs are not internally routed to the bottom inputs unless you use a patch cable. Some patch bays also offer a programmable ground, which offers more flexibility in the studio. Since I own a Redco patch bay, I'm going to be using the terminology that they use to describe the 3 types of grounding their patch bays come with. In my research for this video, I emailed Redco directly to learn more about the grounding types, as there's not a lot of information on the internet, and they were able to reply within the hour. If you're in the market for an affordable patch bay with pro features, I recommend a Redco patch bay. This is not a sponsored video, they didn't pay me to say this, I just really love this product that I paid full price for. We have 3 options: a bust ground, a vertically strapped ground, or an isolated ground. A bust ground is the most common ground, and that's where all of your connection points are sharing a common ground. When I spoke to Redco directly about this, they said that modern gear likes to see a common ground, and it often doesn't introduce any noise into the signal. If your patch bay doesn't have grounding options, it's going to be a bust ground, and that works great for most common applications. A vertically strapped ground maintains the ground from source to destination, or from your outputs to your inputs, and each vertical pair has an isolated ground from the vertical pairs around it. And this is seen if you had mic tie lines that are normaled into your mic preamps. That way, each microphone is isolated from one another, but it's able to share that common ground with the mic preamp that it's normaled to. An isolated ground provides each connection with its own ground. And this is useful for isolating noisy gear or for using vintage gear that doesn't like to share a common ground in your patch bay. A bust ground is the default for most patch bays. If your patch bay offers a vertically strapped pair of grounds, we can more properly ground our signals between our mic tie lines and our mic preamps to reduce our chances of experiencing interference while utilizing a patch bay. And if we can isolate our ground, we can, if we experience noise in our patch bay, isolate something specifically to address a problem. Again, that bust ground is the default for a reason, and I view vertically strapped and isolated grounds as tools that we can utilize to get a little bit more out of our patch bay. So now we have a great understanding of how patch bays work, whether you're looking to design your own or just understand them a little bit better so your next session can run smoothly. Thanks so much for watching.